Detective Sarah Mitchell had seen her share of cold cases in her 23 years with the Phoenix Police Department, but none haunted her quite like the Rebecca Coleman murder. The file sat on her desk like a ghost, its yellowed pages and faded photographs a constant reminder of justice delayed. September 15, 1988. A bright Tuesday morning that had turned into the darkest day in Phoenix history. Rebecca Coleman was only 19 years old when someone took her life in the parking lot of Desert Valley Community College. She was a nursing student, beloved by everyone who knew her. With dreams of working in pediatric care, her parents, Donald and Martha Coleman, had moved to Phoenix from Ohio just 2 years earlier, hoping the Arizona sun would help Martha's chronic asthma. Instead, they buried their only daughter under that same merciless sky. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes and stared at Rebecca's senior photo. Blonde hair, bright blue eyes, a smile that could light up a room. The kind of girl who volunteered at animal shelters on weekends and baked cookies for the elderly neighbors. The kind of girl who didn't deserve to die alone in a parking lot, her textbooks scattered around her, her future stolen in broad daylight. The case had gone cold within 6 months. No witnesses, no murder weapon, no viable suspects. The lead detective back then, James Morrison, had worked himself into early retirement over it, unable to shake the guilt of leaving the Colemans without answers. Sarah had been a rookie cop when it happened, directing traffic and writing parking tickets. She remembered the media frenzy, the community vigils, the desperate pleas from Rebecca's parents on the evening news. Now, 37 years later, Sarah was the head of the cold case unit, and new technology had breathed life into old evidence. DNA analysis that didn't exist in 1988 could now pull genetic profiles from the smallest samples. And 3 weeks ago, a breakthrough had finally come. The crime lab called on a Friday afternoon. Sarah had been about to leave for the weekend when the phone rang. Dr. Chen's voice was steady but excited. They had extracted DNA from beneath Rebecca's fingernails, samples that had been preserved but never properly tested with modern techniques. They ran it through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, and got a hit. Sarah's heart had stopped when Dr. Chen said the name. Thomas Brennan, not some drifter or career criminal, not some stranger from out of state. Thomas Brennan, 62 years old, currently living in Scottsdale. Owner of Brennan Construction Company. Married, 3 children, 12 grandchildren. Active member of St. Catherine's Catholic Church. Little League coach. Volunteer at the Phoenix Food Bank, a pillar of the community. Sarah spent the next 3 weeks building an airtight case. She couldn't afford mistakes, not with someone like Thomas Brennan. His family was well-known, well-respected, and wealthy. His attorney would be expensive and ruthless. She needed more than just DNA. She needed motive, opportunity, and a timeline that couldn't be disputed. She started with 1988. Thomas Brennan had been 25 years old, fresh out of Arizona State University with a degree in business. His father, Patrick Brennan, owned a small construction company, and Thomas was working his way up, learning the trade from the ground up. He lived in Tempe at the time, just 15 minutes from Desert Valley Community College. Sarah pulled his old driver's license photo from the DMV archives. Dark hair, strong jaw, confident smile. He looked like every all-American boy who'd ever played high school football. Nothing about him screamed murderer. But then again, they rarely did. She interviewed his former co-workers, people who'd worked alongside him in 1988. Most remembered him as hard-working, ambitious, maybe a little too intense. One retired foreman, 80-year-old Bill Hutchins, recalled Thomas having a temper when things didn't go his way. Nothing violent, he insisted, just moody. Prone to disappearing for long lunches, coming back quiet and withdrawn. Sarah dug deeper. Rebecca's friends from college. Her professors. Her co-workers at the part-time job she held at Walgreens. Slowly, a picture emerged. Rebecca had mentioned a guy who kept showing up at the Walgreens, always buying unnecessary items just to chat with her. Her best friend, Jennifer Hollis, now Jennifer Martinez, still lived in Phoenix. Sarah tracked her down to a modest home in Glendale. Jennifer was 56 now, a grandmother herself, but her eyes filled with tears when Sarah showed her Rebecca's photo. They sat in Jennifer's living room, surrounded by family pictures and the smell of fresh coffee, while Jennifer remembered her best friend. Rebecca had been uncomfortable with the attention from this older guy, Jennifer said. He drove a pickup truck, wore construction boots, always came in dusty from work. He told Rebecca he was going to build his own empire someday, that he could give her everything she ever wanted. Rebecca had politely declined his advances. She had a boyfriend, Marcus, a fellow nursing student. She wasn't interested, but the guy didn't take no for an answer. He started showing up at the college, waiting by her car. Rebecca had been scared, Jennifer said, her voice breaking. She'd told Jennifer just 2 days before she died that she was thinking about reporting him to campus security. The guy had gotten angry the last time she rejected him, had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Did Rebecca tell you his name?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. Jennifer shook her head. She only knew he worked in construction. But she remembered something else. Rebecca had shown her a business card he'd given her. Brennan Construction. Patrick Brennan and Son. Sarah's blood ran cold. There it was. The connection she needed. She obtained warrants for Thomas Brennan's financial records from 1988. His truck had been registered in his name. A blue Ford F-150. Sarah pulled the original case file and found a detail that had been overlooked. A witness had reported seeing a blue pickup truck in the college parking lot around the time of Rebecca's murder. But in 1988, blue pickup trucks were everywhere in Arizona. It had been considered too generic to pursue. Now it was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Sarah worked 16-hour days, building the case methodically. She found Rebecca's old Walgreens co-worker, now living in Flagstaff. The woman remembered the construction guy, remembered how he made Rebecca uncomfortable. She even remembered him coming in the day after Rebecca died buying flowers. When the co-worker mentioned what had happened, he'd acted shocked, devastated even. Then he never came back. The profile grew clearer. Thomas Brennan had been obsessed with Rebecca. When she repeatedly rejected him, when she threatened to report his harassment, he'd snapped. The DNA under her fingernails proved there'd been a struggle. She'd fought back. And in that parking lot 37 years ago, Thomas Brennan had silenced her forever. Sarah prepared the arrest warrant with trembling hands. She thought about Donald and Martha Coleman, who had died within 5 years of each other, both from broken hearts according to those who knew them. They never got their answers. They never got their justice. But their daughter would finally have both. The arrest was scheduled for dawn. Sarah assembled her team, briefed them carefully. Thomas Brennan wasn't considered dangerous now, but desperation could change anyone. They would approach his Scottsdale home at 6 a.m. before he left for work, before his wife and family could interfere. Sarah didn't sleep the night before. She kept seeing Rebecca's face, young and hopeful, cut down before her life truly began. She thought about the nursing career that never happened, the patients Rebecca never saved, the children she never had, the life she never lived. Tomorrow, Thomas Brennan would finally answer for what he'd done. Tomorrow, after 37 years, Phoenix would finally have its reckoning. The morning air was crisp and cool, unusual for Phoenix even in October. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of the unmarked SUV, watching the sky lighten from black to deep purple. Officer Marcus Webb drove, his jaw tight with tension. Behind them, 3 more vehicles carried the tactical team, all silent, all focused. Thomas Brennan's house was exactly what Sarah expected. A sprawling ranch-style home in North Scottsdale, probably worth $2 million, with desert landscaping and a 3-car garage. Security lights illuminated the circular driveway where a Mercedes and a Lexus sat parked. The American dream built on blood and lies. At precisely 6 a.m. they moved. Sarah's heart pounded as she approached the front door, her badge ready, her hand resting on her sidearm. Webb rang the doorbell. They could hear movement inside, footsteps, then a woman's voice calling out that she was coming. The door opened. Carol Brennan stood there in a silk robe, her gray hair perfectly styled even at this hour. Confusion etched across her well-maintained face. She was 60 years old but looked 50, the kind of woman who had personal trainers and dermatologists on speed dial. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm Detective Sarah Mitchell with the Phoenix Police Department. We have a warrant for the arrest of Thomas Brennan." Carol's face went white. "There must be some mistake. My husband is a respected businessman. He's never even had a parking ticket. Ma'am, I need you to step aside and call your husband to the door." Carol's hands shook as she gripped the doorframe. "What is this about? You can't just come here and—" "It's about the murder of Rebecca Coleman in 1988. The name hit Carol like a physical blow. Sarah saw recognition flicker across her face just for a moment, before she regained her composure. That was so long ago. Tom didn't even know that girl. Ma'am, please call your husband. Thomas Brennan appeared behind his wife, already dressed in slacks and a polo shirt, ready for his day at the office. He was still handsome at 62, fit and tan, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority. But Sarah saw something else in his eyes when he looked at her badge. Fear, calculation, and underneath it all, rage. Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Coleman. You have the right to remain silent. This is ridiculous, Thomas interrupted, his voice controlled but strained. I don't know what you think you have, but you're making a massive mistake. We have your DNA, Mr. Brennan, extracted from beneath the victim's fingernails. Would you like to explain how it got there? For just a moment, Thomas's mask slipped. Sarah saw the young man who'd killed Rebecca, who'd wrapped his hands around her throat and squeezed until her struggling stopped. Then the mask returned, and he was the respectable businessman again. I want my lawyer. Carol started crying, clutching at her husband's arm. Tom, what is she talking about? What DNA? You said you never knew that girl. Thomas pulled away from his wife with barely concealed irritation. Call Richard. Tell him to meet me at the station. And for God's sake, Carol, stop crying. This is a misunderstanding that will be cleared up by noon. But his voice lacked conviction, and Carol heard it. She staggered backward, one hand pressed to her mouth, watching as Sarah cuffed her husband's wrists behind his back. Neighbors were starting to emerge from their homes, drawn by the police presence. The tactical team formed a perimeter, keeping curious onlookers at bay. As Sarah led Thomas to the SUV, she saw his children arriving, summoned by their frantic mother. Angela, the eldest daughter, a lawyer herself. Michael, the middle child who ran the construction company with his father. And Ryan, the youngest, a high school teacher. They stood frozen on the lawn, watching their father being placed in the back of a police vehicle. Dad, Angela shouted, running toward them. Don't say anything. I'll have Richard at the station in 20 minutes. Thomas nodded, his face stony, but Sarah saw his jaw tremble. Reality was setting in. 37 years of freedom were ending. 37 years of living as if Rebecca Coleman had never existed, as if her blood wasn't on his hands. The drive to the station was silent except for the radio chatter. Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Thomas, who stared out the window at the passing Phoenix landscape. Was he remembering 1988? Was he thinking about the moment he decided Rebecca had to die? Or was he already planning his defense, calculating his odds, figuring out how to spin this into reasonable doubt? At the station, media vans were already gathering. Someone had tipped them off, probably intentionally. The police department wanted the community to know that even after 37 years, justice could still be served. Sarah led Thomas through the back entrance, avoiding the cameras, but she knew by nightfall his face would be on every news station in Arizona. The interrogation room was small and sterile, painted in institutional beige with a metal table bolted to the floor. Sarah sat across from Thomas while Webb stood by the door. They waited for Richard Goldstein, Phoenix's most expensive criminal defense attorney, the kind of lawyer who got celebrities and politicians out of impossible situations. Goldstein arrived within 30 minutes, immaculate in a three-piece suit, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. He was 70 years old, sharp as a razor, with a reputation for destroying prosecutions on cross-examination. Don't say a word, Tom, Goldstein commanded before even sitting down. Then he turned to Sarah with a cold smile. Detective Mitchell, I assume you think you have a case here. Let's hear it. Sarah laid out the evidence methodically. The DNA match, the eyewitness testimony from Rebecca's friends about the harassment, the business card, the blue pickup truck, the timeline that placed Thomas at the college the day of the murder. She watched Goldstein's face, looking for cracks, but found none. When she finished, Goldstein leaned back in his chair. That's circumstantial at best. DNA transfer can happen in dozens of innocent ways. My client is a prominent businessman who's never been in trouble with the law. You're destroying his reputation based on flimsy evidence from nearly 4 decades ago. The DNA was under her fingernails, Mr. Goldstein, from skin cells extracted during a violent struggle. Your client's skin. Can you explain that? Goldstein didn't blink. We'll have our own experts examine the evidence. Lab contamination. Chain of custody issues. The technology wasn't even available in 1988. which raises questions about how these samples were stored and handled. A good defense attorney, which I am, will shred this in court. Sarah leaned forward. Your client stalked Rebecca Coleman for weeks. He harassed her at her workplace. He showed up at her college. Multiple witnesses will testify to this. When she rejected him for the final time, when she threatened to report him, he killed her. That's not circumstantial. That's premeditated murder. For the first time, Thomas spoke. His voice was low and dangerous. You have no idea what you're talking about. Goldstein put a hand on his client's arm, but Thomas shook it off. He stared at Sarah with undisguised hatred. I built an empire from nothing. I've employed thousands of people. I've donated millions to charity. I've coached Little League and volunteered at food banks. I have a family who loves me, a community that respects me, and you want to destroy all of that based on some DNA that could have gotten there 100 different ways. How did it get there, Mr. Brennan? Tell me one innocent way your DNA ended up under a murdered girl's fingernails. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. Goldstein stood abruptly. This interview is over. My client won't be answering any more questions. We'll see you in court, detective. And I promise you, when I'm done, you'll wish you'd never reopened this case. As they left, Sarah sat alone in the interrogation room, her hands shaking with adrenaline. The battle was just beginning. Thomas Brennan had money, influence, and one of the best lawyers in the state. The community was already divided. Social media was exploding with hot takes. Some people believed he was guilty, that wealth and respectability didn't equal innocence. Others insisted it was a witch hunt, that the police were desperate to close an old case and had fixated on an innocent man. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her captain. Press conference at 3 p.m., be ready. She thought about Rebecca Coleman, 19 years old, fighting for her life in a parking lot while a monster stole her future. She thought about Donald and Martha Coleman, dying without answers. And she thought about Thomas Brennan, living free for 37 years while Rebecca rotted in the ground. This case would define her career. It would consume her life, and she would see it through to the end, no matter what it cost. The press conference was chaos. Reporters shouted questions over each other while cameras flashed like lightning. Captain James Rodriguez stood at the podium, his uniform crisp, his expression grave. Sarah stood beside him, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes analyzing her every movement. We are here today to announce an arrest in the 1988 murder of Rebecca Coleman, a case that has remained unsolved for 37 years. Thanks to advances in DNA technology and the tireless work of our cold case unit, we have arrested Thomas Brennan, age 62, of Scottsdale. He has been charged with first-degree murder. The room erupted. A reporter from Channel 12 shouted loudest. Captain Rodriguez, Thomas Brennan is a well-known philanthropist and businessman. What evidence do you have linking him to this crime? Rodriguez gestured to Sarah. Detective Mitchell will address the specifics. Sarah stepped to the microphone, her voice steady despite her nerves. We have DNA evidence that conclusively places Mr. Brennan at the scene. We also have witness testimony establishing that Mr. Brennan had been stalking and harassing Ms. Coleman in the weeks leading up to her murder. When she rejected his advances and threatened to report his behavior, he killed her. Another reporter jumped in. The Brennan family is claiming this is a rush to judgment. They say you're targeting an innocent man to close an embarrassing cold case. How do you respond? Sarah's jaw tightened. The evidence speaks for itself. We don't arrest people to close cases. We arrest people when the evidence proves their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Rebecca Coleman was 19 years old with her entire life ahead of her. Someone took that from her. After 37 years, she finally has justice. But even as Sarah spoke, she could feel the tide of public opinion shifting. Social media was dividing into camps. Thomas Brennan's supporters flooded platforms with character testimonials, photos of him coaching youth sports, letters from employees praising his generosity. The hashtag Free Thomas was trending within hours. Meanwhile, others rallied behind Rebecca. Women shared their own stories of being stalked, harassed, and not believed. They posted Rebecca's photo, young and smiling, with messages about how wealth and status didn't make someone innocent. Justice for Rebecca became the counter-movement. Phoenix was fracturing down the middle. Sarah returned to her office to find it buried in messages. Some were supportive, thanking her for never giving up. Others were vicious, accusing her of destroying a good man's life for career advancement. One email particularly stung, from someone claiming to be a former Little League parent. "You're going after a man who taught my son about honor and integrity. You should be ashamed." Webb knocked on her door carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You doing okay?" Sarah took the coffee gratefully. "Define okay, fair point. Listen, I've been going through more of the old files. I found something interesting. In 1989, there was a reported assault at Arizona State University. Female student claimed a guy in a pickup truck tried to grab her in a parking lot. She fought him off but never got a good look at his face. The case went nowhere. Sarah's pulse quickened. Timeline? March 1989. 6 months after Rebecca. Did she give a description of the truck? Webb pulled out a photocopy. Blue Ford F-150, late 80s model, same as Brennan's. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. He tried again. After he got away with killing Rebecca, he thought he could do it again. Looks that way. The victim's name is Patricia Hernandez. I tracked her down. She's living in Tucson now, married with kids. I called her this morning. When I mentioned Brennan's arrest, she went silent for a long time. Then she said she'd been following the news, and when she saw his photo, something clicked. She thinks it might have been him. Can she testify? She's willing to talk to you. I'm setting up a meeting for tomorrow. For the first time since the arrest, Sarah felt a spark of hope. If they could establish a pattern, show that Thomas Brennan was a serial predator, not just a man who made one terrible mistake, it would strengthen their case immeasurably. That evening, Sarah drove to Glendale to meet with Jennifer Martinez again. Jennifer had agreed to testify at trial, but Sarah wanted to make sure she understood what that meant. Richard Goldstein would come at her with everything he had, trying to discredit her memory, her motives, her relationship with Rebecca. They sat in Jennifer's backyard, watching the sun set over the Phoenix Valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jennifer's husband brought them iced tea, then left them alone. "I've been getting messages," Jennifer said quietly. "People saying I'm lying, that I'm making up stories about Rebecca and this mystery construction worker. Some are saying I'm jealous of Thomas Brennan's success, that I'm trying to tear down a good man." Sarah set down her glass. "Jennifer, I need you to understand something. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Brennan's attorney is one of the best in the country. He's going to paint you as confused, mistaken, or malicious. He's going to dig into your past, looking for anything he can use against you. Can you handle that?" Jennifer met her eyes, and Sarah saw steel beneath the gentleness. "Rebecca was my best friend. I held her mother while she sobbed at the funeral. I watched her father turn into a ghost. For 37 years, I've carried the guilt of not pushing Rebecca harder to report that man to campus security. Maybe if I had, she'd still be alive. So yes, detective, I can handle whatever Brennan's lawyer throws at me, because this isn't about me. It's about Rebecca." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. If you're feeling moved by Rebecca's story and want justice to prevail, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This case is about to take a turn no one saw coming, and you'll want to follow every moment. The trial date was set for February, 4 months away. Sarah knew those months would be brutal. Goldstein filed motion after motion, challenging the DNA evidence, the witness testimonies, the chain of custody. He demanded access to every piece of evidence, every lab report, every interview transcript. He was looking for holes, and in a case this old, holes existed. Meanwhile, Sarah continued building her case. She tracked down more of Rebecca's friends and co-workers. She found the campus security officer who'd been on duty the day Rebecca died, now retired and living in Flagstaff. He remembered the day vividly, arriving at the scene to find Rebecca's body, her books scattered, her car door open. He also remembered something he'd never put in his official report because it seemed insignificant at the time. A blue pickup truck had peeled out of the parking lot just as he arrived. He'd assumed it was a student late for class. Now looking at photos of Thomas Brennan's 1988 Ford F-150, he nodded slowly. Could have been that truck. Can't say for certain, but it matches what I remember. Every piece mattered. Every witness. Every detail. Sarah was building a mosaic, and while each individual tile might seem small, together they formed an undeniable picture of guilt. The meeting with Patricia Hernandez took place in a quiet coffee shop in Tucson. Patricia was 49 now, a middle school teacher with kind eyes and nervous hands. She stirred her coffee repeatedly as she spoke, never quite meeting Sarah's gaze. "I've spent 36 years trying to forget that night," Patricia said. I was 20 years old walking to my car after a late study session at the ASU library. This truck pulled up beside me and the driver asked for directions. When I walked over to help, he grabbed my arm and tried to pull me toward the truck. I screamed and fought, managed to scratch his face, and he let go. He drove off before I could get a plate number. Did you report it? Patricia nodded. Campus police took a statement, but I couldn't identify him. It was dark and everything happened so fast. All I remembered was the truck and his voice, deep angry, like he was used to getting what he wanted. When they couldn't find the guy, the case just faded away. Sarah showed her a photo lineup with Thomas Brennan's 1989 driver's license photo, mixed in with 5 similar-looking men. Patricia studied it for a long time, her finger hovering over the images. Finally, she pointed to Thomas. I can't be 100% certain, but something about his face, his eyes. It could have been him. When I saw him on the news after the arrest, it triggered something, a memory I'd buried. Would you be willing to testify to that? Patricia's hands shook. My husband doesn't even know this happened to me. I never told him. I was ashamed, like somehow it was my fault for being out alone at night. But when I saw Rebecca Coleman's photo, this beautiful young girl whose life was stolen, I thought about my own daughters. If someone had information that could help solve their murder, I'd want them to come forward. So yes, I'll testify. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Patricia's hand. Thank you. You might be the key to showing the jury that Thomas Brennan is a predator, not a respected businessman who made one mistake. As Sarah drove back to Phoenix that night, she felt the case solidifying. The DNA, the harassment, the witnesses, the attempted assault 6 months later. Piece by piece, Thomas Brennan's carefully constructed life was crumbling, revealing the monster underneath. But she also knew Goldstein was preparing his own narrative. He'd paint Thomas as a victim of overzealous police work, of unreliable decades-old memories of a justice system desperate for a win. He'd present Thomas's charitable work, his family, his spotless record. He'd suggest the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that the witnesses were mistaken or lying. It would come down to 12 jurors and who they believed. The pillar of the community or the dead girl who couldn't speak for herself. Sarah was determined to be Rebecca's voice. The pre-trial hearings began in January, and the courtroom became a theater of legal warfare. Richard Goldstein moved through each session like a predator, challenging every piece of evidence with surgical precision. He brought in his own DNA experts who testified about contamination possibilities, degradation of samples over time, and the unreliability of genetic material stored for nearly 4 decades. Sarah sat in the gallery, watching Goldstein work, feeling her case being picked apart thread by thread. Judge Helen Morrison presided with stern impartiality, a 20-year veteran of the bench known for her no-nonsense approach. She allowed the defense their challenges but set clear boundaries. The media circus intensified. Thomas Brennan's family held their own press conferences, with Carol standing by her husband, tears streaming down her face as she proclaimed his innocence. His children spoke of a devoted father who'd never missed a school play or baseball game. Former employees testified to his generosity, his fairness, his integrity. Meanwhile, advocacy groups rallied behind Rebecca. Vigils were held at Desert Valley Community College, now renamed and expanded but still carrying the shadow of that terrible day in 1988. Students who hadn't even been born when Rebecca died held candles and signs demanding justice. The case became a flashpoint for larger conversations about violence against women, about how wealth and status protected perpetrators, about cases that went cold because society didn't value certain victims enough. Sarah worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and determination. Webb became her anchor, bringing her food, forcing her to take breaks, reminding her that she couldn't pour from an empty cup. But Sarah couldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rebecca's face. 2 weeks before trial, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman named Diane Foster called the police department, her voice shaking. She'd seen the news coverage and needed to talk to someone about Thomas Brennan. Sarah met her at a diner in Tempe, away from cameras and crowds. Diane was 60 years old, a retired real estate agent with gray hair and worried eyes. She ordered coffee but didn't touch it, her hands clasped tightly on the table. I dated Thomas Brennan in 1987, Diane began. We met at a construction industry event. He was charming, ambitious, everything seemed perfect at first. But then he started getting possessive. He wanted to know where I was every minute. He'd show up unannounced at my office, at my apartment. When I tried to break up with him, he wouldn't accept it. What happened? Diane's voice dropped to a whisper. One night in March 1987, we had an argument in my apartment. I told him it was over, that I didn't want to see him anymore. He grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against the wall. He didn't choke me, but his hand was there, tight enough that I couldn't breathe properly. He said if he couldn't have me, nobody could. Then he just let go. Walked out like nothing happened. Did you report it? Diane shook her head, shame coloring her cheeks. I was embarrassed. He came back the next day with flowers, apologizing, saying he'd been stressed about work. I didn't press charges, but I also never saw him again. I moved to California for a few years just to get away. When I came back to Arizona in the early 90s, I heard he'd gotten married and settled down. I thought maybe he'd changed. Sarah felt her pulse racing. This established a pattern of violence, of possessive behavior, of threats. Combined with Patricia Hernandez's testimony about the attempted assault, it painted Thomas Brennan as a dangerous man who'd been hiding behind a respectable facade for decades. Would you testify to this? Diane's eyes filled with tears. I've been carrying guilt for 37 years. After I saw Rebecca Coleman's photo and read about what happened to her, I realized if I'd reported him, if I'd pressed charges, maybe she'd still be alive. So yes, I'll testify. It's the least I can do. Sarah immediately contacted the prosecution team. Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen was a rising star, known for his meticulous preparation and powerful courtroom presence. When Sarah told him about Diane Foster, his eyes lit up. This changes everything. We can establish a pattern. Brennan wasn't just some guy who lost his temper once. He's a serial abuser who escalated to murder when he couldn't control his victim. The prosecution filed an emergency motion to include Diane's testimony as evidence of prior bad acts. Goldstein fought it viciously, arguing it was prejudicial, irrelevant, and that a consensual relationship from 1987 had no bearing on an alleged crime in 1988. Judge Morrison took 2 days to deliberate, then ruled in favor of the prosecution. The testimony is relevant to establishing the defendant's pattern of behavior, character, and propensity for violence when rejected by women. The jury will hear it. Goldstein's face turned red with anger, but he composed himself quickly. He leaned over to Thomas and whispered urgently. Sarah watched Thomas's reaction, the mask of respectability cracking just slightly, revealing the rage beneath. The trial began on February 10th. The courthouse was packed, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. Security was heightened after threats had been made against both Sarah and the Brennan family. Phoenix police stood guard at every entrance, checking bags, screening visitors. Jury selection took 3 days. Goldstein used his challenges to eliminate anyone who seemed too sympathetic to victims' rights groups or who admitted to following the case closely on social media. Chen countered by removing anyone with close business ties to the Brennan family or who expressed skepticism about cold case prosecutions. They ended up with 12 jurors, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 67. A retired teacher, a software engineer, a nurse, a construction foreman who'd never worked for Brennan, an insurance adjuster, people from different backgrounds, different perspectives, united by the responsibility of determining one man's guilt or innocence. Michael Chen's opening statement was powerful and precise. He stood before the jury, his voice calm but compelling, and told them Rebecca Coleman's story. He showed them her photo, spoke about her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse, described the terror she must have felt in those final moments as Thomas Brennan attacked her in that parking lot. The evidence will show that the defendant stalked Rebecca Coleman for weeks. He harassed her at her workplace. He showed up at her college. When she rejected him and threatened to report his behavior, he murdered her. His DNA was found under her fingernails, proving she fought for her life. Witnesses will testify to his pattern of violence, his inability to accept rejection, his belief that women existed for his possession. After 37 years, Rebecca Coleman will finally have her day in court. And when you've heard all the evidence, you will find Thomas Brennan guilty of first-degree murder. Goldstein's opening was equally compelling but took a different approach. He portrayed Thomas as a victim of circumstantial evidence, and a justice system desperate for closure. He spoke of the 37 years Thomas had lived as a model citizen, building a business, raising a family, contributing to his community. He suggested the DNA evidence was unreliable, the witnesses mistaken or motivated by publicity, the entire case built on speculation rather than fact. My client is not a murderer. He's a grandfather, a businessman, a pillar of this community. The prosecution wants you to believe that this man, who has never been in trouble with the law, who has dedicated his life to building and creating, rather than destroying, suddenly became a killer at age 25, and then never showed any violent tendencies again. Does that make sense? Or is this a tragic case of wrong place, wrong time, and forensic evidence that's been misinterpreted and mishandled? The first week of testimony was dominated by forensic experts. Dr. Chen from the crime lab explained in painstaking detail how DNA was extracted from beneath Rebecca's fingernails, how it was preserved, how modern technology allowed them to create a profile that matched Thomas Brennan with a probability of 1 in several trillion. Goldstein's expert, Dr. Raymond Walsh, a renowned forensic scientist from California, countered with testimony about contamination risks, handling errors, and the degradation of genetic material over time. He suggested that while the DNA might match, there were innocent explanations for how it could have gotten there. The jury listened intently, taking notes, their faces revealing nothing. Then came the witnesses. Jennifer Martinez took the stand, her voice steady as she described Rebecca's fear of the construction worker who wouldn't leave her alone. She recounted the bruises on Rebecca's arm, the business card, the threat to report him to campus security. Goldstein cross-examined her relentlessly. Isn't it true you can't identify my client as the man Rebecca spoke about? Isn't it true your memory of events from 37 years ago might be unreliable? Isn't it true you've given interviews to media outlets and might be motivated by publicity? Jennifer held firm. I know what Rebecca told me. I saw her fear. And when I saw your client's photo after his arrest, something in my gut told me that was him. Maybe I can't prove it in a way that satisfies you, but I know the truth. Patricia Hernandez testified next, describing her attempted assault in 1989. Her voice shook as she recounted the terror of being grabbed, the desperation of fighting back, the years of nightmares that followed. She pointed to Thomas when asked if she could identify her attacker, though she admitted she wasn't completely certain. That man has the same eyes, the same build, the same voice, I remember. I can't say with absolute certainty, but I believe it was him. Then Diane Foster took the stand and the courtroom fell silent. She described her relationship with Thomas, the possessiveness that escalated to violence, the hand around her throat, the threat that if he couldn't have her, nobody could. Goldstein tried to discredit her, suggesting she was a scorned ex-girlfriend seeking revenge, but Diane remained calm. I have nothing to gain from being here except peace of mind. I should have reported him in 1987. Maybe if I had, Rebecca Coleman would have lived to become the nurse she dreamed of being. The prosecution rested their case after 2 weeks. Sarah watched from the gallery as Chen delivered his closing argument, weaving all the evidence together into an undeniable tapestry of guilt. The DNA, the harassment, the pattern of violence, the witnesses who risked public scrutiny to tell their truth. Now it was Goldstein's turn to present the defense. Richard Goldstein's defense strategy was masterful in its simplicity. He didn't try to explain away every piece of evidence. Instead, he created doubt, that reasonable sliver of uncertainty that could mean the difference between conviction and acquittal. His first witness was Dr. Margaret Williamson, a forensic pathologist from Johns Hopkins who'd reviewed all the autopsy reports and evidence documentation. She testified that while DNA was found under Rebecca's fingernails, the original autopsy noted minimal defensive wounds, which seemed inconsistent with a prolonged struggle. If Rebecca Coleman fought her attacker as vigorously as the prosecution suggests, we would expect to see more significant injuries to her hands, more tissue under her nails, more evidence of a sustained physical confrontation. The presence of DNA doesn't necessarily indicate violence. It could indicate a brief, non-violent contact that occurred earlier that day or even days before. Chen objected repeatedly, but Judge Morrison allowed the testimony. The jury looked confused, uncertain. Sarah felt her stomach twist. Next came character witnesses, a parade of people whose lives Thomas Brennan had touched. His pastor from St. Catherine's spoke of Thomas's devotion to his faith, his volunteer work, his generous donations. Former Little League players, now grown men with families of their own, testified about the positive impact he'd had on their lives, how he taught them about integrity and perseverance. One witness particularly struck Sarah. Marcus Rivera, 32 years old, stood before the court with tears in his eyes. He'd been a troubled teenager, headed down a dark path of drugs and crime when Thomas Brennan hired him at 17 to work construction. Thomas had mentored him, believed in him when no one else did, helped him get his GED and eventually a contractor's license. Mr. Brennan saved my life. He's the father I never had. I know what the prosecution is saying, but the man they're describing isn't the man I know. The Thomas Brennan I know builds things, he doesn't destroy them. Goldstein let the testimony breathe, let the jury see the Thomas Brennan who existed beyond the accusations. Then he called Thomas's children to the stand, one by one. Angela Brennan Torres spoke of a father who never missed a school event, who taught her to be strong and independent, who encouraged her to become a lawyer, even when other men of his generation thought women belonged at home. Michael Brennan described working alongside his father for 20 years, learning not just about construction, but about treating employees with dignity and fairness. Ryan Brennan, voice-breaking, talked about his father coaching his basketball team, attending every game, being present in ways Ryan's friends' fathers never were. How can you reconcile the man the prosecution describes with the father you know? Goldstein asked each of them. The answer was always the same. I can't, because that man doesn't exist. My father is innocent. Finally, Goldstein called Thomas Brennan to the stand. It was a risky move, exposing him to Chen's cross-examination. But Goldstein was betting that the jury needed to hear directly from the accused. Thomas took the oath with a steady hand, sat in the witness box with perfect posture, and looked directly at the jury as Goldstein began his questions. Mr. Brennan, did you kill Rebecca Coleman? No, I did not. Did you know Rebecca Coleman? Thomas paused as if gathering difficult memories. I knew who she was. I went to Walgreens where she worked a few times. She was always kind, always smiling. But I didn't know her personally. The prosecution has presented testimony that you harassed her, that you showed up at her workplace and her college. Is that true? Thomas shook his head slowly. I stopped at Walgreens maybe 4 or 5 times over a couple months. It was near a construction site where I was working. Sometimes I'd buy supplies there, sometimes just a drink. Rebecca helped me a few times. We made small talk the way you do with cashiers, but I never harassed her. I never went to her college. I never gave her my business card. How do you explain your DNA being found under her fingernails? I can't explain it. I've thought about it constantly since my arrest. Maybe we shook hands once and I don't remember. Maybe there was some kind of contamination at the lab. I honestly don't know. But I swear on my children's lives I didn't kill that girl. Sarah watched the jury. Some seemed moved by Thomas's testimony. Others looked skeptical. It was impossible to tell which way they were leaning. Then Chen stood for cross-examination, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Mr. Brennan, you testified that you only went to Walgreens 4 or 5 times, but we have testimony from multiple employees that you came in much more frequently, specifically seeking out Rebecca. Were they all lying? Thomas's jaw tightened. I don't remember exactly how many times I went there. It was 37 years ago. Maybe it was more than 4 or 5. But I wasn't seeking out anyone specifically. You don't remember. Chen paced in front of the witness stand. You don't remember if you gave Rebecca your business card. You don't remember how your DNA got under her fingernails. You don't remember going to her college. That's a lot of not remembering for someone who just testified with such certainty about your innocence. I remember that I didn't kill her. Everything else is fuzzy because it was decades ago and it wasn't significant to me at the time. But it was significant to Rebecca Coleman, wasn't it? Significant enough that she told her best friend she was afraid of you. Significant enough that she was planning to report you to campus security. That's not true. I never scared anyone. Chen pulled out a photograph, had it admitted into evidence, and showed it to Thomas. This is Diane Foster from 1987. Do you remember her? Thomas's face paled slightly. Yes, we dated briefly. Did you put your hand around her throat during an argument? Thomas hesitated for just a moment too long. That was a misunderstanding. We had a disagreement, things got heated, but I never hurt her. You put your hand around her throat and told her if you couldn't have her, nobody could. Is that your definition of not hurting someone? I was young and stupid. I said things I didn't mean. But I never actually hurt Diane, and I certainly didn't kill Rebecca Coleman. Chen moved closer. Let me ask you something, Mr. Brennan. In all your years of character building, volunteer work, and community service, did you ever once express remorse about Rebecca Coleman's death? Did you ever donate to victims' rights organizations? Did you ever reach out to her family? Thomas looked confused by the question. I didn't know her family. Why would I reach out? Because an innocent man, a good man, hearing about a young woman brutally murdered in his community might feel compelled to help. But you didn't, did you? You just went on with your life as if she'd never existed. I felt bad about what happened, but I didn't know what I could do. Chen's voice rose with controlled intensity. Or maybe you didn't feel bad at all. Maybe you were relieved when the case went cold. Maybe you thought you'd gotten away with murder, and for 37 years you did. Objection, Goldstein shouted, jumping to his feet. Argumentative, sustained, Mr. Chen, rephrase or move on. But the damage was done. Sarah saw it in the jurors' faces, the seed of doubt about Thomas's carefully constructed image. Chen continued for another hour, systematically dismantling Thomas's testimony, pointing out inconsistencies, highlighting convenient memory lapses. By the time he finished, Thomas looked exhausted and rattled, the mask of respectability finally cracking under pressure. The defense rested. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following day. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She drove to Desert Valley Community College, now called Phoenix Valley Community College, and walked to the parking lot where Rebecca had died. It had been repaved dozens of times since 1988, expanded and modernized, but Sarah could still feel the echo of that terrible day. She stood in the spot where Rebecca's body had been found and imagined that bright Tuesday morning. Rebecca walking to her car with her nursing textbooks, thinking about her classes, her future, her boyfriend Marcus. And then Thomas Brennan appearing, angry that she'd rejected him one too many times, determined that if he couldn't have her, no one could. Had Rebecca begged for her life? Had she tried to reason with him? Or had she fought silently, desperately, clawing at his hands as he choked the life from her? Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Tomorrow it would all come down to 12 strangers deciding whether justice could still be served after 37 years. The closing arguments were theatrical and emotional. Goldstein spoke for 90 minutes, reminding the jury of the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, the reasonable doubt that permeated every aspect of the prosecution's case. He painted Thomas as a victim of circumstantial evidence and a justice system more interested in closure than truth. DNA can be transferred innocently, memories fade and become unreliable. Witnesses can be mistaken or motivated by factors we can't fully understand. What we can't do is convict a man of murder based on possibilities and maybes. The prosecution hasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Thomas Brennan killed Rebecca Coleman. They've presented a theory, a narrative, but not proof. And in America, we don't convict people on theories. Then Michael Chen stood, and his voice rang through the courtroom with quiet power. 37 years ago, Rebecca Coleman had her entire life ahead of her. She wanted to be a pediatric nurse. She wanted to help sick children. She wanted to fall in love, get married, have kids of her own. But Thomas Brennan decided she didn't get to have those things. Because she rejected him. Because she threatened his ego. Because she was going to report his harassment. Chen walked over to the evidence table and held up Rebecca's photograph. Look at her. She was 19 years old. She fought for her life. We know this because the defendant's DNA was under her fingernails. Not transferred innocuously. Not from a handshake. From a violent struggle where she scratched and clawed, trying desperately to survive. He turned to the jury. The defense wants you to believe this is all coincidence, that the DNA is explainable, that multiple witnesses are mistaken, that the pattern of violence is irrelevant. But sometimes the simplest explanation is the truth. Thomas Brennan stalked Rebecca Coleman. He harassed her. When she rejected him, he killed her. And then he lived 37 years as if she never existed. Chen's voice grew stronger. Rebecca Coleman can't speak for herself, but the evidence speaks for her. The DNA speaks for her. The witnesses speak for her. And now you must speak for her. Find Thomas Brennan guilty of first-degree murder. Give Rebecca Coleman the justice she's been waiting 37 years to receive. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Sarah barely ate, barely slept. She paced the halls of the courthouse, checking her phone obsessively, waiting for the call that a verdict had been reached. It came on a Friday afternoon. The jury had reached a decision. The courtroom filled within minutes. Thomas Brennan sat at the defense table, his family behind him, his face pale but composed. Sarah sat with Michael Chin, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Judge Morrison entered. All rise, everyone stood. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Sarah tried to gauge their expressions, looking for any hint, but found nothing. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a software engineer named David Park, stood. We have, Your Honor. In the matter of the state of Arizona versus Thomas Brennan on the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find? David Park looked directly at Thomas Brennan. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Carol Brennan screamed, collapsing into her daughter's arms. Thomas's face went blank, emotionless as if he couldn't process what he'd just heard. Reporters rushed for the doors to break the news. Judge Morrison banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. After 37 years, Rebecca Coleman finally had justice. 3 years later, October 2028, Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance of Rebecca Coleman Memorial Park, watching children play on the newly installed equipment while their parents sat on benches under the Arizona sun. The park had been built on a piece of land donated by the city, a living tribute to a girl whose life had been stolen but whose memory refused to fade. A bronze statue stood at the park's center, Rebecca captured in mid-stride with books under her arm and a smile on her face, forever 19, forever hopeful. The plaque beneath read, Rebecca Ann Coleman, 1969-1988, aspiring nurse, beloved daughter. Her voice was silenced, but her story will never be forgotten. Sarah came here often, especially on difficult days. Today marked 3 years since Thomas Brennan's conviction, and she needed the reminder that justice, though delayed, could still prevail. The sentencing had taken place 2 months after the verdict. Judge Morrison showed no mercy. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thomas Brennan, then 62 years old, would die behind bars. As he was led away in shackles, he turned to look at his family one last time. Carol had already filed for divorce. His children sat stone-faced, torn between the father they'd known and the monster he'd been revealed to be. The appeals had begun immediately, of course. Goldstein filed motion after motion, challenging the DNA evidence, the witness testimony, the jury instructions. Each appeal was denied. The Arizona Supreme Court upheld the conviction unanimously. Thomas Brennan's legal options were exhausted. Sarah had visited him in prison once, 6 months after sentencing. She'd needed to look him in the eye and ask the question that haunted her. Why? They'd sat across from each other in the visitation room, separated by plexiglass, speaking through phones. Thomas looked older, grayer, diminished by his orange jumpsuit and the harsh fluorescent lighting. Why did you kill her? Sarah had asked simply. Thomas had stared at her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was empty, devoid of the charm and confidence that had defined him for so long. She made me feel small. I was trying to build something, become someone, and this girl who worked at a drugstore made me feel like nothing. I gave her attention, showed interest, offered her a better life. And she looked at me like I was pathetic, like I was beneath her. So you killed her. I didn't plan it. I just wanted to talk to her, make her understand. But she said she was going to report me, that I was harassing her. She threatened to ruin everything I was building. I grabbed her, tried to make her listen, and then... Thomas had paused, his face twisting with something that might have been remorse or might have been self-pity. It happened so fast. By the time I realized what I'd done, she was gone, and you just left her there. Went on with your life. What else could I do? I couldn't bring her back. So I buried it, convinced myself it never happened. Got married, had kids, built my business, became the man everyone expected me to be. And it worked. For 37 years it worked until it didn't. Thomas had smiled bitterly. Until it didn't. That conversation had given Sarah closure, though it hadn't made the years of Rebecca's absence any less tragic. She'd learned that evil rarely looked like monsters. Sometimes it looked like little league coaches and respected businessmen and devoted fathers. Sometimes it wore a mask so convincing that even the monster himself believed it. Sarah's career had changed dramatically after the trial. She'd been promoted to captain of the cold case unit, Given a larger team and more resources, the Brennan case had proven that even decades-old crimes could be solved with perseverance, technology, and witnesses brave enough to come forward. She'd solved 6 more cold cases in the 3 years since, bringing justice to families who'd waited years for answers. Each case was different, but they all shared the same bittersweet quality: relief that the truth had finally emerged, grief that it had taken so long. Jennifer Martinez had become an advocate for cold case victims, speaking at conferences and working with police departments across the country. She'd written a book about her friendship with Rebecca, the impact of her murder, and the long road to justice. The proceeds went to scholarships for nursing students at Phoenix Valley Community College. Sarah had attended the book launch, watching Jennifer sign copies for readers who'd been moved by Rebecca's story. One woman, probably in her 60s, had approached with tears in her eyes. "My daughter was murdered in 1995, the woman had said. The case went cold. Reading about Rebecca gave me hope that maybe someday my daughter will get justice too." Jennifer had hugged her tightly. Never stop hoping. Never stop fighting for her. Patricia Hernandez had found unexpected peace through her testimony. The act of speaking publicly about her attack had freed her from decades of shame and fear. She'd started a support group for assault survivors in Tucson, a safe space where women could share their stories without judgment. Diane Foster had moved to Oregon to be closer to her grandchildren, but she stayed in touch with Sarah. In their last phone call, Diane had said something that stuck with Sarah. "For 37 years, I carried guilt about not reporting Thomas when he assaulted me. The trial didn't erase that guilt, but it transformed it into purpose. Now I tell every young woman I meet, report it, speak up, don't let him silence you. Maybe I can't save Rebecca, but I can save someone else." The Brennan family had fractured irreparably. Carol remarried 2 years after the divorce, moving to California to escape the shadow of her former husband's crimes. Angela had left Arizona entirely, taking a job with a law firm in New York, unable to practice in a state where everyone knew her as the murderer's daughter. Michael had kept the construction company but changed its name, trying to distance himself from his father's legacy. He'd given several interviews about reconciling the father he'd loved with the killer he'd become. "It's like mourning someone who's still alive," he'd said. "The dad I knew died the day he was arrested. I'm still grieving that man while hating what he did." Ryan had quit teaching and become a counselor working with at-risk youth. He told Sarah once that he felt compelled to undo some of the damage his father had caused, to build something good from the wreckage of their family name. The case had changed Phoenix, too. The city implemented new protocols for investigating stalking and harassment complaints, recognizing that what seemed like minor incidents could escalate to violence. Rebecca's Law, passed by the state legislature, mandated that law enforcement take all reports of stalking seriously and maintain better records that could be cross-referenced if patterns emerged. Sarah stood in the park, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, approached the statue with flowers. She placed them at the base, then stood with her head bowed for a long moment. Sarah walked over. "Did you know Rebecca?" The young woman shook her head. "No, I'm a nursing student at Phoenix Valley. We learn about her in our orientation, about how she never got to live her dream but inspired so many of us to live ours. I'm graduating next month and I wanted to thank her." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "She would have been proud of you." The young woman smiled. "I hope so. I'm going into pediatrics because of her story. If she couldn't save children, maybe I can do it in her memory." After the woman left, Sarah sat on a bench near the statue. She thought about all the lives Rebecca's story had touched. The cold cases solved because detectives refused to give up. The women who reported stalkers instead of staying silent. The nursing students who chose pediatrics. The ripple effects of one girl's stolen life, transforming tragedy into purpose. Her phone buzzed with a text from Webb. New lead on the Martinez case from 2001. Possible DNA match. "Can you come in tomorrow?" Sarah smiled. The work never stopped. There were always more victims waiting for justice, more families waiting for answers, more cases that refused to stay buried. She typed back, "I'll be there at 7. As she stood to leave, Sarah placed her hand on Rebecca's bronze shoulder. 3 years ago, standing in this spot, she'd promised Rebecca that her voice would be heard, that her story would matter, that her death would mean something beyond the tragedy of a life cut short. She'd kept that promise. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the park lights flickered on, illuminating Rebecca's statue against the darkening sky. Children's laughter echoed across the playground. Parents gathered their families to head home. Life continued as it always did, but now with the knowledge that even after 37 years, truth could emerge from darkness. Sarah walked to her car, but before she drove away, she looked back one more time at the statue of the girl who'd never gotten to grow old, never gotten to save the children she dreamed of helping, never gotten to live the life she deserved. But Rebecca Coleman's legacy lived on, in every cold case solved, in every stalker reported, in every nursing student who chose pediatrics, in every person who refused to let injustice have the final word. Justice might be delayed, but it would never be denied. Not while detectives like Sarah Mitchell kept fighting. Not while witnesses like Jennifer, Patricia, and Diane kept speaking truth. Not while communities kept remembering the victims who couldn't speak for themselves. Rebecca Ann Coleman, 1969-1988. Her voice was silenced, but her story would never be forgotten.